Gilles Villeneuve has been considered by many to be one of the fastest and most naturally gifted drivers in Formula 1 history. During his short F1 career, the Canadian had many now iconic performances, such as at his aggressive battle for second at the 1979 French Grand Prix, and his victory at the 1981 Spanish Grand Prix where he held off multiple faster cars on his way to victory. His never-give-up attitude was something to be admired, and many believed he was destined to become world champion, and in 1982, it seemed that the Canadian would have his best chance at winning the world championship yet. Tragically though, at the Belgian Grand Prix weekend, Gilles Villeneuve was killed in a crash during qualifying, ending the Canadian's short, but great F1 career. But what if this incident didn't happen? How would Gilles Villeneuve have done, and would he have ever won the world championship? Well, in today's video, we will discuss how Gilles Villeneuve's career could have panned out, had this accident never occurred. So, if the fatal accident in Belgium never occurs, what happens in 1982? Well, Ferrari had clearly the best car, which earned them the Constructors' Championship, despite losing both of their drivers, and Gilles Villeneuve was contractually the number one driver at the team. So, I think that as long as the Canadian doesn't make too many mistakes, it's likely that Gilles Villeneuve would have won the 1982 championship. However, one of the big questions of the 1982 season would be about the Canadian's relationship with teammate Didier Pironi. After Pironi ignored team orders at the San Marino Grand Prix, Villeneuve vowed to never speak to Pironi again, 2 weeks before he was killed. So, would Villeneuve have still hated Pironi throughout 1982? And what would Villeneuve think about the Frenchman's career-ending crash in Hockenheim? Well, it's hard to say really. Personally, I think that their relationship would have remained tense throughout the season, but I would like to think that after Hockenheim, they would become friends again. After the 1981 season, Ron Dennis of McLaren had contacted Villeneuve about joining the British team in the future. The Canadian rejected this offer and decided to stay with Ferrari for the 1982 season. However, this has led to speculation that Villeneuve could have rejoined McLaren at some point in the early 80s, but I don't think this would happen for two reasons. The first being that after winning a championship with Ferrari, I don't think Villeneuve would want to leave, especially since he was contractually their number one driver. And two, if McLaren had to choose between Alain Prost and Gilles Villeneuve, I think that they would go for the Frenchman since he was younger and just as talented. Because of this, I think that it is likely that Villeneuve would have remained at Ferrari during the mid-80s. Moving on to 1983 now, with Gilles Villeneuve being joined by Frenchman Patrick Tambay at Ferrari, while René Arnoux would not join the Scuderia like he did in reality since Arnoux didn't want to be a number two driver. In 1983, Ferrari had once again built themselves an excellent car that would win them the Constructors' Championship. However, Renault and Brabham were much closer in 1983, with improved speed and reliability. It is debatable as to whether Villeneuve would have been able to beat the Renault of Alain Prost and the Brabham of Nelson Piquet. But personally, I think that the Canadian would win his second world championship this season. This is because, in the real 1983 season, Ferrari didn't have a clear number one driver. This led to both Arnoux and Tambay fighting for the championship and taking points off of each other, just like what happened to Williams in 1986 and McLaren in 2007. So I think, with Villeneuve contractually the number one driver, the Canadian would bring home another drivers' championship for Ferrari. In 1984, Ferrari, now with Italian Michele Alboreto replacing Patrick Tambay, would struggle to compete with the dominant McLaren team. I imagine that Villeneuve would be able to achieve a race win or two, but would be far behind the McLaren drivers in the championship. Ferrari would be closer to McLaren in 1985, and with Villeneuve leading the charge instead of Alboreto, I imagine that we would have seen a great championship battle between Prost and Villeneuve this season. At least until the last few races where Ferrari's title campaign fell apart. I imagine that this would be comparable to more modern F1 seasons, like 2017, 2018, and 2022. While Villeneuve would fail to bring home another drivers' championship, I think that Ferrari would now win the Constructors' Championship in 1985, since Villeneuve would probably score a lot more points than Stefan Johansson did in reality. I imagine that the battles between Prost and Villeneuve this season would become legendary, and would now be seen as a precursor to the Senna-Prost rivalry, with the more conservative and calculated Alain Prost battling a more aggressive and on-the-edge driver. This rivalry wouldn't last though, because 1986 would be a terrible year for Ferrari. Their new car was bulky and had incredibly poor handling. Gilles Villeneuve and Ferrari would have their first winless season since 1980. I imagine that the relationship between the Canadian and the Scuderia would start to worsen over the course of the 1986 season, as Villeneuve would become disillusioned with the team. Eventually, I think that Villeneuve would decide to leave Ferrari at the end of the season. So now the question is, who would Villeneuve drive for in 1987? Assuming he doesn't retire. Well, McLaren had tried to sign Villeneuve back in 1981, so maybe he could replace the retiring Rosberg. Personally, I doubt this since the British team already had plans to sign Senna after his Lotus contract expired. Also, Alain Prost has gone on record saying he didn't want Nelson Piquet at McLaren because he didn't want another experienced champion creating an inter-team rivalry. I imagine that something similar would be said about Villeneuve. Personally, I think that Gilles Villeneuve would most likely have joined the Benetton team, who had achieved their first victory at the 1986 Mexican Grand Prix, courtesy of Gerhard Berger, and became the de facto works Ford team. The Austrian would also leave Benetton to join Ferrari for 1987, so maybe Berger and Villeneuve could have had a straight swap, and the Canadian would have driven alongside Italian Teo Fabi at Benetton. Benetton were more consistent in 1987 than they had been the previous year, but they didn't win any races. The closest they got was at the Mexican Grand Prix again, where Thierry Boutsen led the race, but retired due to an electrical problem. I imagine Villeneuve would have done better than Fabi or Boutsen did, and maybe he would have gotten a pole position, but I doubt he would have won a race. Villeneuve would be in his late 30s at this point, around the time most top drivers from this era retired. I think that maybe Villeneuve could have done 2 or 3 seasons for Benetton, but it would be nearly impossible to beat the exceptional Honda-powered cars of this era. The best chance Villeneuve would get at achieving a final race win would be the 1989 Japanese Grand Prix, which was won by the Benetton of Alessandro Nannini, after Senna was disqualified from the race. If Villeneuve was still racing for Benetton at this point, he almost definitely would have been Benetton's top driver and would win this race, assuming he didn't collide with Senna when the Brazilian tried to retake the lead. After 1989, I imagine that Gilles Villeneuve would have retired from Formula 1. The Canadian would have turned 40 in 1990, and with it looking less and less likely that he would be able to compete with the younger frontrunners, Villeneuve would be gone from F1 when the 1990s started. However, this might not have been the end of the Canadian's racing career. Both his brother and son continued racing into their 50s. If Gilles did this, then he could have still been racing competitively in the early 2000s. And I think it is possible that Gilles would have done this too. For example, could Gilles Villeneuve have joined IndyCar after leaving Formula 1? Plenty of F1 champions did in the early 90s, such as Emerson Fittipaldi, Mario Andretti, and Nigel Mansell. The Villeneuve family also had connections to IndyCar already, with his brother racing in the series in the 1980s, and of course his son would go on to win the Indy 500 and the IndyCar Championship in 1995, so I don't think it is impossible that Gilles would also have raced there, and potentially could have won the Indy 500 at some point. Part of me also wonders if Gilles Villeneuve could have entered the 24 Hours of Le Mans after his F1 career. And if things went his way, could Gilles Villeneuve have won the Triple Crown? So in conclusion, if Villeneuve had survived 1982, he probably would have been a world champion, and he would have remained one of the top drivers throughout the 1980s, despite having little chance at winning a third world championship, and could potentially have added himself to the list of great drivers who fell out with Ferrari, depending on how the 1986 season went. It kind of reminds me of how Fernando Alonso's career looks so far. He won 2 championships early in his career and then was never at the right team to win a third championship.